Hi everyone, I'm Heather Egan Sussman with Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe, and my one big thing for the Incident Response Forum is to share how incident response professionals can leverage their skills and experience to build an infection response plan so that as workplaces come back into the office from remote working, you can help to reduce infection exposure, ensure business continuity, and minimize legal risk.
Welcome back once again, and thanks for that last panel. Very different and a bit of a break from the legal panels that we had before with some good old-fashioned storytelling. For this next panel, as I mentioned earlier, understanding the legal issues of national security has become a major aspect of any incident response because there is so often a global threat actor in the mix, if you can figure out the attribution or at least find something in the ballpark. And how to manage that international dynamic has become an area of specialty within itself. And we have really a terrific panel to go over this and explain to everyone exactly how to handle this, at least as best they can in the time they have. Starting off, we have Lisa Monaco from O'Melveny and Myers as the moderator. We really couldn't have a more perfect moderator for this panel than Lisa. She's held several senior positions at DOJ under the administrations of President Clinton, President George W. Bush, and President Barack Obama, including as an Assistant Attorney General for National Security, which we know is DOJ's top national security department, and also as a Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to President Obama. If you have a half hour or so, you should take some time to read Lisa's biography. She is an esteemed adjunct professor at both NYU and Harvard. She has multiple board membership. She's on all sorts of committees. And in 2017, Governor Andrew Cuomo named Lisa to a bipartisan counterterrorism advisory panel for the state of New York. She's also leading O'Melveny's COVID-19's task force. Lisa, even though I don't know you very well, I watched your 30-minute interview on C-SPAN. You are phenomenal. I hope you will return to government someday because we need people like you to protect us. Welcome today. Looking forward to having you as moderator.
Thanks very much, John.
Excellent. And next up is David Lashway, who better to be on this panel than David. He's one of the more experienced globe-trotting cyber lawyers there is. He's global co-chair of the cybersecurity practice at Baker McKenzie. And he's manages incident responses all over the world, including China, North Korea, and Libya. He's another IR lawyer that is far more than what they call a breach coach. He'll also lead the inevitable data breach-related litigation that follows very quickly, the remediation, and help you with any regulatory or criminal matters that arise. And if your company blames its vendors for a particular breach, which is pretty much going to happen about 100% of the time, David can represent them too. As an aside, David was also lead counsel to the cyber investigation firm working the hack of the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Thanks for joining us, David. It must be especially hard for you staying in one place for so long. Welcome.
Thanks, John. Delighted to be here.
Excellent. Next up, we have Michael Sussman from Perkins, Coie, my old friend. He is one of the better-known national security lawyers here in town. Most notably, Michael represented the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign in their responses to Russian hacking in the 2016 presidential election. And I don't know too many lawyers courageous enough to take on that kind of situation, but I do know that Michael is one of them. And I go way back with Michael. We first met when he was at the Department of Justice as special counsel to the Attorney General almost 20 years ago. He would later join the computer crime section in DOJ, where he began to combine his national security experience with cyber. And when I was at the SEC, we even had some chances to work together. I'm proud to have known Michael way back when, and I'm thrilled that he can join us this year for his first ever IR forum. Welcome, Michael.
John, thank you so much. As you said, I've been doing computer intrusions and breaches since 1997, and there aren't a lot of people in the field that I go back with that far. And so I enjoyed working with you from time to time when you were at with the SEC, but I've just enjoyed throughout this long period of time having you pop up in all sorts of different roles. And I'm just really grateful to be seeing you again today. Thanks.
Thanks. You too, Michael. And last up is Brekke. And this is someone who is right in the middle of everything right now. He has not slept at all. He's a deputy GC at DHS, Deputy General Counsel, as opposed to the other government lawyers you'll hear from today. He has been on the job less than a year. And you talk about a baptism under fire. Before joining DHS, Ian worked at Covington and Burling here in Washington. He plays multiple roles regarding IR, including measuring the threat of countries against the U.S. and investigating data security incidents for purposes of national security. He has been working, and I think he's being modest, 8 hours a day on COVID-19. And if anyone thinks, well, if I can become a government employee, I'm going to have to work less than I will at my law firm, I think Ian would disagree with that. I really want to welcome Ian. I want to thank Ian for keeping us safe. And thanks especially for managing this national security threat amid COVID-19. And I think this is very tricky territory for lawyers trying to figure out how to work with DHS. And I'm so glad that you're there. So welcome today to your first incident response forum.
Thank you, John. Very pleased to be here and very happy to be able to represent DHS today.
Excellent. Okay, well, Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then I'm going to go meet with our next, I think we have a keynote coming up. Good luck to this panel, and we really appreciate it. Take it away.
Thanks, John. Thanks for kicking us off. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our session. Look, the topic, national security and cyber attacks, we should, as always, when we're talking about this topic, I think start with what we think about the threat landscape. And this is a great group to get your perspective on what the threat landscape looks like. What are you seeing from your particular roles and in your particular practices in terms of the tactics, the actors, and where the trends are going? So, Ian, let me start with you. Obviously, DHS, big role, plays a very big role in assessing this landscape. Can you just give us briefly your perspective, and then I'll ask the same of David and Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. There's definitely a lot that we do in this space. Cybersecurity and national security are core missions of the department. And it's really a collaborative effort. So I think most folks here might be familiar with CISA, formerly National Protection Program Directorate. But basically, we are the nation's risk advisor. So we look at all forms of cyber threats, and we really try to work collaboratively through information sharing, through our resources and tools, to help our private sector and state and local stakeholders, assess and mitigate their own threats. But there's certainly a lot of things that we're tracking on right now in the middle of COVID-19. I think some of which have probably been covered already today. But I'll just highlight a couple things because in 2019, obviously, we all saw a massive surge in ransomware attacks across the country, and it was definitely more hard hit for state and locals. And I think in COVID-19, we're seeing similar tactics, be it ransomware, phishing, and other attacks as people transition to a new mode of working, as people are out there looking for critical items of information on a daily basis about healthcare policies and protocols, as well as the guidance for workers out there. And so we're seeing those vulnerabilities, and we as CISA and at the department are just trying to put out as much good information as we can right now. We're also tracking on a few other things that I think are pretty interesting, but I'll just highlight one of them. So one thing that has become big for us is vulnerabilities on the internet-facing sites for our critical infrastructure systems, largely the industrial control systems. And we've really been pushing for some legislation that would give us some administrative subpoena authority in that area, because one of the issues we find is we identify a vulnerability. It could be a vulnerability that could impact large swaths of the U.S. population, but we don't always have information about who owns that system because a lot of these ICS systems are out of date. So one of the things we've been working on is a way to have a limited subpoena authority that's really consistent with CISA's mission for having limited use and protecting sensitive and proprietary information. But those are just a couple of the things that we're really tracking on right now.
Great, thanks, Ian. And I'm sure that subpoena authority is going to be of tremendous interest to Michael and David's and my clients going forward. So, Michael, let me go to you to give your perspective on the threat landscape. What are you seeing in your practice?
Sure, lots of threats, always lots of threats. I want to focus on three that are making it harder to sort of find the bad guys and stop what's going on and requiring some new tactics. The first one is, the threat from China continues, but what we and a lot of people are seeing is increased investment in U.S. companies and in VCs, particularly in AI, but in other areas as well. And putting someone on the board or someone at a VC gives them tremendous access to all the tools for greater social engineering, for email, for PII. It gets them closer to where the data is stored. And those breaches are just a lot harder to detect. And so we're seeing a big uptick in this kind of money coming in, seeing that increase in 2020. And that's requiring a different sort of focus for companies to look at. The second thing is adversaries are putting a lot greater resources into having their foreign nationals hired at U.S. companies. And when those nationals get hired at U.S. companies, there isn't a hacker. It's not a hacker hunt paradigm anymore. It's an insider threat paradigm. And while reviewing logs is certainly a helpful tool, it's a lot more difficult to detect that. And background checks usually don't matter because our adversaries are very good at finding graduate students, young professionals, helping them get placed at companies. And if they have family back at home, then using coercion to recruit their assistants once they're employed. So we're seeing a lot more resources in that way. And there's been news this year, and there are DOJ prosecutions in this regard, a tough thing to defend against. The third thing is we've seen probably 4 times in the last 6 months virtual attacks on the spouse or partner of a targeted person inside a company. And that's even more of a concern now in that many of us have our spouses or partners in our workspace. But those people are providing great access, they're less suspecting, and it's a bigger attack surface. And it means that companies need to not only look at their professionals, but look at their sort of wider network in protecting them. And the last thing I want to add is just an observation that we understand from the national security professionals that 90% of state-sponsored attacks today are through social engineering and phishing. It's so effective that there's no need to do sort of hacking attacks on company hardware because the social engineering attacks are so effective. So for companies out there, and again, it's the same tactic that criminals use and sort of everyone uses, but the nation states can put a lot of resources into making them look, the fake websites look the best, and sort of putting in a lot of research and a lot of backstory. But again, it's you want to have a hard infrastructure, but you also don't want to have an admin that is clicking on cat videos.
Great. Thanks, Michael. David.
Yeah, I think Ian and Michael both provided a pretty good overview of what we've been seeing as well. But maybe pulling the lens back a little bit, Lisa, and looking at it from a nation state perspective, I think one of the trends we've been seeing is that although we in the United States, I believe, continue to enjoy cyber hegemony, we have a remarkable power as a nation state to affect cyber outcomes, as well as engage in deterrent activity. And our Justice Department in the last several years, including under the Obama administration, as you full know, as well as under the Trump administration, have been exploring and utilizing a lot of national security related tools to enhance deterrence in this area. One of the things that we've seen is that nation states recognizing gaps in power and the ability to utilize cyber as a weapon have in fact weaponized it. And over the last 15 or 20 years, as Michael indicated, those of us that have been in cyber for a long time know that financial crime, which was the bread and butter of cyber hackers for many, many years, along with engaging in other types of criminal activity, whether it was in the healthcare sector, financial sector, or other sectors within the private sector, those financial crimes have now become the acts of nation states. We saw that with North Korea. We've certainly seen it with Iran and other nation states as well. What are we seeing outside of financial crime? We're seeing that same exact trend where information warfare was originally activities within social media and outside of social media, private parties or funded parties engaging in information warfare type activities. We're now seeing nation states engaging in that activity. Michael is very competent and going to be talking about that today in the context of the election from 2016 and what we're seeing going into the election in 2020. that has been the subject of just remarkable amounts of attention, both with CISA as well as U.S. federal government agencies and other entities around the world who have suffered from this as we've navigated the world on those types of issues. The other thing we've seen, and I think even more troubling than even information warfare in many respects, is operational interference increases and the use of operational interference cyber techniques by nation states in a more prolific and more efficacious manner. Really what we've seen is, instead of just disruptive events, we've moved on to destructive events. And while disruptive events are on the rise in all of their manifestations, whether it's ransomware or other types of techniques, and I won't get into the details of those techniques here, but I think from a macro perspective, disruptive events, no doubt, as we heard from both Ian and Michael, are on the increase, and we're going to continue to see that. Last year was the year of the municipality, and that continued through December, and we saw that with the Iranian events around the holiday period into January. But I think even more troubling, as I mentioned, from NotPetya, which has been described as the most destructive cyber attack in history, forward, we are seeing time and again nation-state entities engaging in destructive related cyber events, and that creates significant challenge for those of us in the private sector as well as in the public sector in order to coordinate to respond.
Thanks very much, David. I think you all have given a great kind of lay down and perspective at from varying vantage points. I would just say, for my part, having been involved in these issues for many, many years, I think all four of us, if we'd been asked this question a couple of years ago, we would have talked about the threat landscape as being diffuse, as being more sophisticated, and more dangerous. My own view is, over the last year, 18 months to 2 years, if you think about the various actors in malicious cyberspace, rather than being so diffuse anymore, if you think about it as a drag race, I really view nation states as having pulled away, far and away, as being the most concerning actors out there, for a lot of the reasons that all three of you have mentioned, in terms of becoming more destructive, going after data sets that will assist in the types of social engineering, widespread social engineering attacks that Michael mentioned. So I think the three of you have given us a very good foundation for today's discussion. Let's transition into the meat of the topic right now, which really is the national security factor, or how we should think about it in incident response, in prevention, detection, and response. I've heard all of you talk about this to some degree, so I'm going to start with you, Michael, and give us your perspective on, how the private sector should be thinking about this. What should they be factoring in to their preparations when it comes to the national security factor?
Sure. And let me grossly overgeneralize and say that in the clients that I work with, new ones that come in and other ones that I see, in the national security space, I will divide them into the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots are the ones that, and there may be plenty good reasons in terms of their scale and their scope and what they do, but they're companies that don't have national security expertise and access to national security professionals. So they don't have employees who have national security clearances and can receive classified briefings or get classified IP addresses, and then and likewise aren't going to have strong contacts at the FBI and the national security side or the U.S. intelligence community. And there are companies that have those innate internal abilities. And so when an intrusion comes up, typically the first question is, who is it? What do they want to do? Sometimes that information can be discovered internally, and sometimes you need external help and external intelligence. And once you determine that it is a nation state, it changes a lot of what you're doing, because you have typically a persistent adversary with a lot of resources who can stay in the fight a long time, and you want to gather the greatest amount of information that you can about that. And so I see both those sides, and I think for companies that can, focusing more on building up that national security game, and making those national security components a part of their incident response plan is important. It's just another one of the questions that should be asked when you have the breathing room before an incident. And then I get this question a lot about, like, well, we're just blank company. How can we defend ourselves against the Russian military, the Chinese military, Iran, et cetera, and the first answer is you can't. If you are there, like if you're their highest priority, which you're not, then typically you can't. But the game with foreign adversaries really is about making yourself less attractive and a harder target. There's that old joke about the two guys running from a bear, and the guy in front just has to be a couple of feet ahead of the other one, or climbing a tree has to be a foot or two higher. And so, again, Lisa, you talked about sort of what we would have said a few years ago, what we say now. There was a time when companies, their objectives was to build the fortress, not let anyone in. Nobody's vain enough now to think that they can do that. It's all about early detection, and in particular for foreign adversaries, it's having a sticky environment, having network segmentation. So when the foreign adversary gets in, which they will, you find them earlier, and they can't get that far. They're locked in. Whatever they get to, they have to sort of do a whole nother level of hacking to get out. You can find them and get rid of them more quickly. And those kinds of, if they're looking for a financial institution, don't be the financial institution with a wide open network that lets the adversary roam around and not get caught for a long time. So I think I preach that bear story to a lot of companies. Don't make yourself that attractive, or certainly less attractive than the other folks out there.
Great. I like the image. David and Ian, you both have talked at varying times about the role of the government and perceptions or misperceptions sometimes of the role of the government in a nation state intrusion that the private sector is dealing with. David, let me get your take, and then I'll go to you, Ian. Wonder if there might be some different perspectives on this.
Sure, thanks. I think as Michael indicated that in response to your question, the role of the national security factor in incident response, particularly where we have nation state actors on both sides of the equation, from my perspective, it fundamentally changes the math of that algorithm in terms of the incident response. First on the offensive side and then on the defensive side. Obviously, I think the way we've traditionally broken it down in the algorithm is three factors: interest, authorities, and competencies. You got to do that on both sides of the equation. You've got to look at what the nation state, who is the affirmative actor engaged in the matter, what their interests are, what authorities they have to act with respect to the attack and their actions pursuant thereto, and what their competencies are to continue to engage in this type of activity and further their interests, the grand state theories that we're now engaged in with respect to national security cyber activity. On the defensive side, it's a similar calculation, but you're looking at it with a defensive hat on. And looking at our authorities and competencies here in the United States, while we have enormous competencies, in fact, I think unquestionably the most powerful cyber capabilities of any government in the world, and I trust we will maintain hegemony in that regard. I certainly hope we do. The authorities that the government currently enjoys with respect to the use of those types of competencies are extremely limited. Whether it's the National Guard authorities, and like we're currently seeing with respect to COVID, and the role of governors in enacting capabilities with respect to the National Guard, all the way in the legislation that was promoted around National Guard authorities to act, and as we saw in the NotPetya events, all the way up through DHS's authorities under CISA, which are extremely limited, across the DoD with Cyber Command and the limitations under 50 and Part 10. So we've got very limited capability currently under our existing authorities to allow the federal government to take direct, discrete action on a private sector target when nation states are involved, notwithstanding the remarkable amount of competency that we have at the federal level in order to engage in cyber deterrence and cyber conflict. From my perspective, at least, that equation is going to have to change. We're in the process now of post-destructive attacks from NotPetya and the types of events that we've seen over the course of the last 18 months, certainly with respect to the Iranian events in December and January. Those calculations are now very different. And I think the role of the lawyer right now is really essential in making sure that we understand in the incidents when there's a national security overlay or a direct national security involvement, that we understand what those competencies are, what those authorities are, and that we navigate those and include that in the math that we're doing in an incident response. Ian, obviously over to you in terms of the competencies coming out of DHS. One thing I would say is one great gain that we have seen as a nation in the last 24 months or so is this increased role from DHS. The CISA team with Krebs and folks like Ian joining that team in the last 2 years, it has been a remarkable sea change. Work that the Obama administration put in place bled through to this administration, and just highly competent talent thinking about these very difficult issues, particularly in critical infrastructure. But frankly, would anyone have said the technology we're using today, Zoom, was critical infrastructure 8 weeks ago, which is clearly now allowing most businesses in the world to operate freely and functionally. The definitions of critical infrastructure are volatile, and they fundamentally change depending upon the circumstances in any matter, as we're learning in COVID. And Ian's team, working 18 hours a day, is clearly on the front lines of that.
Thanks, David. Yeah, over to you, Ian, because I think I agree absolutely with what David said about the role that CISA has taken up and thinking more expansively and in a more nuanced way, rather, about critical infrastructure. I think is really important. But on the cyber front and on this question of cyber authorities, I'm curious about your perspective on David's comments. And then I'm actually going to ask both Michael and David to tell us how that landscape and that description of authorities impacts what you're telling your clients in the heat of the moment, and how that should influence how they're responding. Ian.
Thank you, David, for your thoughts. I will concur with you that CISA's authorities are different. They're definitely not like anything people are used to seeing, because they're non-regulatory, they're non-law enforcement, they're non-IC. They're really there just to be a facilitator of information sharing, to help incident response in particular, and then also to obviously protect the .gov, the internal federal executive networks for the civilian networks. But they actually have quite a few capabilities that they offer, which is really consistent with our mission at DHS. I mean, we are intimately familiar with the national security threats posed by nation-state actors from cyber incidents, but we're also currently guided by several statutory authorities and internal executive authorities, including the Obama administration's PPD 41, right, which is the U.S. Cyber Incident Coordination Authority, which it says at its fundamental level that cyber incident response is a shared responsibility between individuals, private sector, and the government. And that's the way we view this. I mean, we have a lot of tools at our disposal. And I know on the CISA side in particular, if you come to us for help, we'll help you however we can. We have varying degrees and types of tools to help, scaling with the sophistication of the person who comes to the type of threat we're talking about. Could be, we offer a lot of free information and guides, which are very helpful for, unsophisticated persons who just are looking to take some, basic cyber hygiene. Then we've got assessments that we perform and a red teaming function. We also do hunt incident response. I mean, we've been doing a lot of this. We share threat indicators. We've got some great, really rich data sets that we provide free of charge. And it's really about collaborating, because I think at the end of the day, the U.S. government cannot do everything itself, and perhaps, depending on what you think about federalism, maybe shouldn't do everything itself. We recognize we have a lot of authority, a lot of budget, but we also don't have the budget or the mission to be the nation's geek squad. So really, we have taken the approach at CISA of doing the best we can to take a nuanced view of what the threats are, work with particular sectors, really break that down based on what the current threat landscape is for a particular sector. We tend to be very responsive as people bring new threats, and obviously we have a lot of really cool capabilities there. But all of that is built around our core mission at DHS as being sort of the risk management leader of the federal government. And we really try to bring that to our private sector and state and local stakeholders. So we don't really play the role of, say, the DoD of cyberspace for the nation. We also aren't the FBI out there enforcing the laws, or the FTC regulators out there. But I think we actually, as a result, have a unique position. And I would say we firmly believe that the state and local and private sector stakeholders out there are ideally positioned to know their threats and to be able to respond to them first. We just want to offer them the tools they can to be the best positioned to do that, whether it's intelligence, whether it's cyber hygiene, and all of that. Just to take the example of COVID, because I think you just mentioned that. It's been a great example of the key role that the federal government plays in coordinating a response. That's really the role we play in any U.S. level cyber incident as well. But, while we have tools like the Defense Production Act, the ability to mobilize the National Guard if the president decides to do that, we're really implementing, or we're really sending those tools out to the states, the locals, the private sector to really do the work that they, have to do. We don't have hundreds of thousands of doctors on staff at the U.S. Federal government that can go out to the various places where there are these hotspots. We can send PPE. We can help eliminate regulatory barriers, but really a big part of what we do is we facilitate and we coordinate on these large scale events. But it really relies on some of the resources and the expertise of the state and local and the private sectors to help do the actual, in this case, it would be hands-on keyboard. But I think in the case of COVID-19, it's the critical infrastructure workers, the healthcare workers, et cetera. So we certainly can surge. I know internal to the government, if we need to surge, we can get the support of DoD and NSA and put more hands-on keyboards for the particular tasks that we as CISA have. But as to the sort of the broader critique, or I guess it would just be a comment on what our authorities are and how we get involved. I think it's more of the you are the best protector of your business, and that's your responsibility. And we were really just there to help, based on the authorities and the budget that we have.
So, Michael, let me get you in here. Given the threat landscape we talked about, given this discussion about authorities, what's your perspective on the role of the federal government? What can they really do in a national security incident of magnitude that's impacting one of your clients, and how does this affect how you're advising folks when they come to you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that goes on and that I tell clients is that we're generally working in parallel with the federal government or state governments, and they're doing, and so I love the government having greater authorities in the cyberspace, and they're doing great work. And oftentimes we may be dealing with the same adversary, and the government is doing what they're doing, and we're doing whatever we can do to defend ourselves, and there can be great results from that. But it's not a likely case for the government to provide direct assistance in our intrusion, if for no other reason other than the scale of the problem across the country. So I'm not painting a rosy picture for clients typically that, well, let's just call DHS or DOD or the Bureau and they'll solve our thing for us. There are great tools. And again, harking back to the comment you made a little while ago about the discussion we have now as opposed to a couple of years ago, DHS is providing a tremendous amount of assistance and tools, but the fight is along sort of parallel tracks. The most valuable area is information sharing. And there's so much more information sharing now for a variety of reasons. And that is critically important to companies. So that is something I'm talking to the client about right away, about have you reached out, and here's who we should talk about. Here's what would be great to learn. And many times you'll think you're the first. We had a company dealing with a Mideast attacker a couple of months ago, and sort of a newish player. And it really was the FBI coming in and telling us, we've seen this in a couple of other places, and telling us what they've seen and letting us sort of gear our game accordingly. So the information sharing is tremendous. There needs to be probably some more tweaking in terms of the antitrust and other issues for sharing. And then I'm going to make a sort of a non-national security or a comment broader than national security. I've heard it earlier this morning, but in terms of authorities and laws, something better needs to be done about making sure that victim companies remain victim companies, because one big impediment in sharing information with the government is you're a company that's been a victim, you've had an attack, and maybe what you put in your privacy policy about how, your use of encryption or what personal information you store is not what the FTC would like to say. And so there's the dynamic about, do we go to the department and tell them about this intrusion and then have to answer the FTC and get a 20-year consent decree as our reward for coming forward? And so we've raised it, and there certainly is greater progress, and I see Ian's raised his hand, but it's a continuing problem, and it's one, and even in cases where, as an advisor, David or I might say, it's in your best interest to report, the company will say, well, couldn't this happen and couldn't that happen? And that risk remains out there. It's a real risk.
Ian, you want to get in here briefly?
Yeah, I would just say, I think we at DHS completely appreciate that. And this is, again, this is going to sound like a CISA pitch more than it is just a discussion. But really, I think CISA benefits from one of the greatest privacy protections of any of the various agencies in the federal government. We take information security incredibly importantly. And I will say, we do not rat people out to the regulators. What you are required to report to your regulator is up to you. We don't assist with that, and we certainly don't force that activity. So, we're really there. There are certainly in times when we are required to share threat information across the government, and there's requirements under CISA 2015 for what information has to be stripped out before we can do that, and PII can only be shared to the point that it's required for sharing the actual threat indicators. But I would just say, one more plug for CISA is, we take information sharing seriously, and it's only as good as the ability for people to trust us with that sensitive, proprietary, business confidential information, which can be essential for helping, do assessments, assess risks. But of course, you're not going to want to share if we're in the business of going and telling everybody else. And that's really because our mission is, just that. So.
And I would have said the same thing about CISA and about the job that you're doing in that regard, but more can be done in this area and it remains an impediment.
So I'm mindful of the time. I want to get through two other topics before we have to close out. The other area that we have seen evolve over the last couple of years, since that's the theme we're trying to hit here, is with respect to insurance. One of the things that we have all seen, I think, over the last couple of years is an increased willingness by the government to make attribution, to come out and call out, and in my mind, to good effect, where nation state actors are responsible for certain intrusions. It began and started back in the Obama administration, and working with colleagues in the National Security Division, where we first called out Chinese state actors engaged in cyber-enabled economic espionage, and has continued and frankly accelerated over the last couple of years. But that has an impact on the private sector when it comes to the insurance landscape. David, let me ask you kind of what your perspective is on this. What does that mean for victim companies when the government comes out and says, "Yep, it was this state actor, and we believe they did it," and they put that out?
It's a really important question. I know we have a panel this afternoon on insurance specifically, but in the context of national security, you're exactly right, Lisa. As every lawyer knows, words matter. Whether they're the company's words as the victim, as Michael pointed out, the vendors that we retain to assist us in the conduct of the investigation to provide the legal advice and attribution activity and determinations they're making in their PowerPoints around who did this, statements made to the board, as was discussed by Luke Dimboski earlier on the board panel, or statements made by the U.S. government, and even more challengingly, I think, for most of us, because as you pointed out at the outset, very few of these significant matters that we would get involved in are intra-United States or solely within the CONUS. They're global matters in nature. And so due to the fact that we have non-homogenized global regimes, people, whether it's NATO, whether it's entities in law enforcement across borders, like Interpol and Europol, whether it's foreign nation states or competitors of the United States that are not necessarily involved in a particular act, but they seek interest by declaring intent or attribution in a particular action, like we saw in NotPetya, the implications on insurance result in vitiation of the insurance. As you know, and in fact, we heard this morning, now today, even a law firm is being sued here in the United States by an insurer for allegedly failing to disclose the existence of a cyber-related event. In the NotPetya context, there are billions of dollars at stake and being litigated in various federal courts here in the United States relating to whether or not the issue resulted in force majeure under those contracts and somehow excused performance by the insurers to pay. It also is not as simple as cyber coverage. And depending on the matter, as we heard earlier on one of the panels about the increase in ransomware, that can trigger K&R insurance, that can roll over to property damage, that can roll over to BI, business interruption insurance, that can also play into cyber insurance coverage, with the communications consultants, the law firms, and the vendors being covered potentially under those policies. So one of the things as part of the incident response plan you have to look at in any incident is what is the company saying? What is the U.S. government saying? And the U.S. government is not a monolith. In the NotPetya event, we had NSA making statements. We had NATO making statements with U.S. representatives. We had the Department of Justice making statements. The certain National Guard representatives were making public statements. We had statements coming out of DHS and the FBI, U.S. Secret Service. So navigating all those different statements that are being made, and they were not consistent in every instance. And now we're seeing, in the context of liability allocation regimes later post-incident, all of those statements being brought forward to say, this is what they said on this date. When did you become aware of the K&R issue, that it was no longer ransomware, such that your coverage under K&R would be disposed of? So exactly as you pointed out, Lisa, declarations by governmental authorities have profound impact in the context of that algorithm in responding to a national security-related incident and incident response. And the plans and the way the lawyers are acting in response must take that into account.
Great. We've just got a few minutes before we've got to wrap. I want to ask, since there's a lot of experience on this panel with regard to election security issues and nation-state adversaries interfering in those elections, Michael, can I ask you just briefly to give us your perspective on, we've seen nation states trying to attack our election infrastructure, but also disinformation campaigns, quite obviously. Should the private sector be concerned that disinformation campaigns are now going to be used against them as well? What's your outlook on that?
There should be. We're seeing disinformation now with regard to COVID. Different countries underreporting, not having that many cases, and in circumstances where it will benefit a country, not all countries, but certainly some adversaries of ours, whether it's the downing of an aircraft or other major events, they'll use whatever sort of information, disinformation benefits them. With regard to companies, it's typically a blunt tool. So it's not, we don't think disinformation is going to overtake phishing and social engineering and all the other bad things that are going on. There was a case that was reported in the last year or so about a Ukrainian bank that there was some disinformation about the safety and security of the bank and a run on funds. So it can be used directly, but it's a blunt instrument, and companies certainly can see its use. And so that's not a hacking breach issue as much as a crisis communications, social engineering, how they take care of the message. And so it's certainly a possibility. My take on everyone's take on 2016, or big take in 2016 was doxing and disinformation. In the first instance, I describe it as its characteristic as being unprecedented and unexpected. And so in thinking about 2020, I certainly could think about the old tricks, but one of the characteristics of 2016 was no one was expecting what happened to happen. And so it sounds so cliche to say, expect the unexpected. But I think that if you're expecting the last problem, then you're more likely to be susceptible to not seeing it when it comes.
Right, fighting the last war.
Yep.
I know we got to wrap in about 30 or 40 seconds. I want to do a lightning round for the three of you. What is the advice you would give to folks listening on how to factor national security in to their strategies, whether it's for prevention, detection, response? David, lightning round.
Yeah, as the perceptions of relative nation-state power are continuing to shift, we're going to see increased effectiveness by nation-states in this space. Don't leave this to others. This is the role of the lawyer, making sure that there's interest, there's authority analysis, there's competency, and that it's included in your planning, and that you've got the key outside stakeholders that you can bring to bear to address the issues.
Great. Ian?
Yeah, I would just say take advantage of the rich resources and sets of data, the automated indicator sharing that we do at CISA. I mean, we have a lot to offer here. And I think, honestly, for 95% of companies out there and locals, if you take advantage of what we have to offer, you're going to have a leg up and you won't be the most easy target for the bear when it's coming.
Nice image. Michael?
Yeah, the same as what David and Ian said. It's about preparation. So earlier I spoke about the haves and the have-nots, and it's put effort into being a have and not a have-not, and take a fresh look at your incident response plan and see if it adequately covers all the national security aspects we're talking about today. And if not, take steps into either building in that expertise, or in the same way you identify in an incident response plan who your crisis communications firm is and who these other assets are, figure out where those resources are going to come from when they're needed.
Great. For my part, I just say, think about what kind of target you are and the data that you're holding. You don't have to be the builder of the F-35 fighter jet to be a target for nation states these days. You got to think very differently about the target and the information you have as being a target for nation states. With that, let me thank the panelists here for a terrific discussion. Really appreciated being able to talk with you today.
And thank you, Lisa. Terrific job. Our first keynote is up next. It's a discussion with Justin Herring, who heads the Cybersecurity Division for the New York Department of Financial Services. That kicks off at 12:40, so just a few minutes. So we'll see you back here in just a minute. Thank you.